Good day, welcome to the show. My name is Nichols, and today I'm going to be talking about the fact that it seems to be mortality all the way down. Now, what do I mean by that? That it is mortality all the way down? Obviously stealing that phrase from Terry Pratchett novels. Well, in some sense, there are thoughts, experiments, and experiences and intuitions that we have which seems to break down when we really try and understand what we are as a consciousness, as this apparently continuous consciousness. And as Sam Harris has pointed out time and again, the idea of a sense of self seems to dissolve under close inspection. So the question is, what are we actually left with? That's a really good question. Now, there is kind of a thought experiment. This experiment is explained by Sam Harris on the Waking Up app. And I think it's Derek Prophet. And basically the thought experiment is such. Just imagine that, look, let's say we can go to Mars. We don't need to use all the phallic rockets that we have right now. You can just teleport there. You and your friends can just teleport over there. Your friends have done it, as Sam Harris has said, and they seem fine. And so you're like, oh, this is awesome. I can just teleport straight to Mars. And you're like, and so you sit there, they're talking about what's going to happen. They're like, well, you know what? So you'll get reassembled in Mars, and of course your body will have to be kind of annihilated here in order for that to happen. And you're like, well, that makes sense. I'll still be me. Sure, like I'll be teleported. I mean, that's what's going to happen. Now, the problem is, of course, is that they tell you after you're pretty much signed on the dotted line, as you're about to go in, they're like, oh, by the way, we don't destroy your body straight away. You press the button, and then there's someone on Mars who gets assembled, but we wait till we make absolutely sure that person on Mars is fine, and then we destroy you. Now, what's interesting about that is that seems to tug at these intuitions. We start to think, just a second, I think I'm just getting yeeted here. I don't think I'm teleporting at all. This seems like a bit of a cruel joke. I'm just going to press that button and sit there. And you're like, just a second, and then I'm just going to get yeeted. This isn't a teleportation. This is just an ending. And even for me, it's actually you can actually push your intuitions a bit more. To suppose that right at this moment I got annihilated completely for some tragic accident, and then through some miracle I just suddenly got spontaneously reformed a moment later. Would that still be me? Not sure. Suppose I was reformed a minute later. Would that still be me? What about an hour? What about a year? What if I was reformed just over there? What happens if I'm reformed in Mars? And again, what happens if I don't get yeeted at all? If I don't dissolve? What happens if I get just formed somewhere else and copied without getting yeeted? What happens then? So there's all these intuitions that get tugged at there if we start thinking we have a sense of self that has to somehow be continuous. The other more complex thing which we might say, suppose we did actually do this thing of someone got reassembled on Mars, that was me, and I'm sitting there after pressing the button, but suppose it was a virtual reality machine and I actually felt like I was in Mars even though I wasn't. So suppose they made it so I had exactly the same experience in some connected way, like I would see the world through exactly the same as the person who was on Mars, and they made sure those things connected, so we're having exactly the same experience, and then I get yeeted. If that doesn't seem quite as bad as me sitting around for, a minute, 5 minutes, a day, a year before getting annihilated. I mean, the intuition is that if you just let me survive a millisecond, then yeet me after my copy is on Mars, that seems fine. But if you let me sit around for a decade and then yeet me, that seems really bad. That just seems like an ending of a life. It doesn't feel like teleportation at all. But functionally, it's not clear what the difference is. Now, I think to me, this is one of the paradoxes that arises because we just see the world in an incomplete and superficial way. Because we don't see the world as it is, obviously. We're seeing the world through a very narrow band in a very specific way. And I often think about it as like a mouse with cheese. Like, the mouse, if you were to explain something about, say, nuclear power or going to space, it would always come back and just go, well, what does that have to do with cheese? Because my world is about cheese and mazes and wheels and squeaking. And you're like, well, it's not really much to do with cheese. Like, nuclear power is like making a bunch of big cheese. And then the rat or the mouse would be like, oh, that's right. Okay, nuclear power is the form of a big cheese. That's how they would see it, But and suppose you said, let's go to the moon, and there's a space station around Earth, and the rat would be like, well, okay, how do I relate that to my little Ferris wheel my hamster wheel that I'm in my cage or a maze? He might say, oh, look, it's this huge Ferris wheel in the sky. There's this huge, hamster wheel in the sky, and that's what powers these rockets. And I think that we're kind of mouse or rats in this case. We're not like super unintelligent, and rats are smart, but they only see the world in terms of what they understand. Cheese and mazes, presumably, and mating probably. So we only see the world in that way. So when we try and explain what happens to our consciousness, we can only see it in terms that we understand at a very, very narrow, superficial view of the world. It's for us, it's like, okay, what does consciousness have to do with cheese? And a super intelligent being would have to kind of come along and say, look, it's not actually cheese, it's something quite different, but I'm trying to explain it in terms of cheese, and that's why it kind of breaks down. And that's what I think about when I think about a lot of these thought experiments. It's something quite different we can't quite comprehend, because we can only understand a conscious life and a conscious moment. And I think there are more correct ways of seeing it, and Sam Harris has basically put this forward, and I tend to agree with him for the most part. One is that the sense of self is illusion. There's no self-bobbing, as Sam would say, on the stream of consciousness. There's just conscious space. That's pretty much it. There is conscious space, and there's just an observation of that. It just exists, not even observed. It just is. And the sense of self is very much an illusion, and it never stays there. It's always changing. There's nothing to hang on to and say, this is me. It's just this flowing stream of consciousness, objects arising and falling in consciousness. And so what happens when you get teleported is there's just other conscious objects in space. They can only ever be where they are, which is in Mars, and they can only ever be observed at that point. And there's a point of observation on Earth, and there's a point of observation on Mars of conscious objects. And when you get yeeted, those conscious objects obviously disappear, but there's other conscious objects in Mars. That's basically it. Now, the other thing, the more sort of practical version of this is what happens to people who have a corpus callosum. I think it's corpus callosum gets cut through, say, refractory epilepsy, which used to be a treatment, and I think still is, but very rarely nowadays. And so what would happen is they'd cut the commissures between your two halves, hemispheres of your brain, so that if you had an epileptic fit in one area, like one pulsing kind of nidus of epilepsy, which is what epilepsy is, if you have this pulsing nidus of seizure behavior, they can't travel across the corpus callosum and affect the other side of the brain, so you're not going to have a full seizure, you're still going to be there. The thing which happens, though, is it seems to be shown experimentally that each side of the brain then has a separate consciousness. And the question is which one is you? Because you started out saying, be me, one consciousness. And then what happens is you divide the corpus callosum and suddenly there's two of you. Which one's actually you? And suppose you rejoin them, then in principle that would come back together and you'd be you again. And it only makes sense is instead you see it as just objects streaming through consciousness. There's no self, there's no center of it. They're just objects in there. And when that gets divided, the objects are just in different areas, but they're still, both objects are you, because there's no actual you as such. They're just objects in consciousness. Now that's highly counterintuitive, but the world is not an intuitive place. And I think that still it seems to explain most readily what's going on, although it is highly counterintuitive for us. But again, that's, I think, the reason why we do meditation, is so we can see the world as it is, not how we intuitively think it to be. Which is why, actually, we see meditation and mindfulness as a form of science, because we are making these observations about the mind that are empirical, but that can be observed by others. We're not asking you to believe anything on faith. We're just saying if you observe your mind, you'll see conscious objects in there in the same way that you'll see the world around you. It's just a slightly different observation, but there is something there. And like someone might say pain in your neck or tinnitus, to example Sam has used, that pain is really there, but no one else can experience it. And there are actually objects in consciousness, emotions rising and falling, and that is a consistent feature of the mind. And we can all experience individually, we just can't really share that experience in the same way we can share more objective scientific facts about the world. All right, I think that's it for me. And thanks very much for joining me. And I'll see you in the next one. Peace.